Okay, so this is a Harvest Right oil-free scroll vacuum pump. It is the smallest one available, and generally I think this is the standard one that they include in freeze dryers. There are larger ones in circulation. I've got a couple off eBay, but that's not the point of this video. What I want to show you today is why Harvest Right is so apprehensive to send out maintenance kits for these things, and why you really shouldn't try to do this yourself. I'm located in Canada, which makes things very expensive to ship to Utah and then ship back again to get this thing maintained. So I went through some trouble and expense to do this myself, and I'm hoping to convince you to let me do it for you too if you're in Canada. You can identify that this is the smallest one by the black feet. It's the simplest way to go. If the feet are not black, you might have a different pump. You might need different parts. That said, when this motor comes off from these bolts here, you're going to end up with something like this. This is not going to be a how-to video. I'm just going to explain what can go wrong and what the difficulties are, what the big deal is. Here's the tools that I have. This one is custom. I'll get to that, why this is needed in a little bit. That's a bearing puller that pulls from the inside of the bearing. A pulley puller, which is may be necessary, but in this case it might not be. A snap ring plier set, a metric set of Allen keys, a hammer, and a very specific size of pin to push out bearings with. And actually, this is the most important one, is a pick. So I'm going to show you what's involved in this. The first thing that can go wrong is that when you take off that screw, there are shims in there, and every one is different. And that has something to do with the tolerance of building that drive shaft in there. There are shims in there. You don't lose those when this thing comes apart. Likewise, on the other side as well, inside that fan, there's a similar kind, inside that housing, there's a similar fan as this with the same screw, and also could be shims in there. If you lose those, it's a bit complicated to figure out how to fix that. And anyways, let me get this to the next step and we'll resume. Okay, here we are at the next obstacle. I flipped the unit upside down. The screw is out and the shims are with it right there. But I haven't removed that yet. So after removing the fan shroud, the next thing is removing this. Often this can be seized on. In this particular case, it can come off by hand, but I have had these, they just won't move. And the last thing you want to do is hit this with a hammer. You can use a hammer at very specific instances, but not just anywhere willy-nilly. If you whack this with a hammer, you could smash something in the inside, and I'll show you why later. So if this is seized on, you need a pulley puller like this. The teeth go around the edges here, and that pin goes in the middle, and it pulls it up with kind of a gentle but very precise high amount of force to lift that off. So there's the fan. That's going to go aside. There'll be a key in here, and sometimes this one is kind of stuck. First use for the pin, not pin, pick. There you go. It's kind of hard to do with one hand, and a limited amount of space here. Let me just pause this video and we'll continue. All right, so that pin is out. The next thing is to remove these screws, but I'm keeping that on. This is kind of slipping into a DIY or instructional video. Again, that's not my intention here. I'm just trying to show you what can go wrong. So I'm going to be taking these out and be right back. Okay, so those bottom screws are now out, and I flipped it over again. Now I'm ready to take this off. Again, sometimes this can be seized on there real good. Pulley puller might be required. In this case, it just pops right off. And likewise, there's a pin in here as well, a keyway. And so now I'm ready to separate these two halves. So it's going to get flipped again. I'm going to use these blocks of wood here to act as a stand so that it can stand flat. You're not putting a whole lot of weight on that drive shaft. But But that won't matter that much in a minute, and I'll show you why. Okay, so the two halves are now separated. Just kind of insert a flat screwdriver into the gap that's there now, like that rough area there. If that gets a little bit scratched, it doesn't matter that much. You want to stay away from any machined surface areas. This thing is kind of, in some regards, it's done really kind of inaccurately and a lot of tolerances, but in other ways, there's high accuracy machining done in here as well. So this is now ready to come off, and it can come off in any number of ways. That's another thing that can kind of go wrong here. When this comes up, sometimes the inner scroll can go with it, sometimes it stays put, and sometimes everything's just jammed together. Again, I've had to use a pulley puller on that to pull this off. And won't get into the details on how that's supposed to work, but let's move on. Okay, so here we are with the two halves separated. There's an O-ring here, and there's an O-ring here. So this is kind of the first time many people will be seeing this kind of tech. This is not a regular vacuum pump. This isn't even a regular pool pump or anything like that. The way this works is that this thing spins around and this just kind of stays stationary, but moves around that. And it kind of creates that kind of spiral polishing motion, and that's what creates the vacuum. So the tip seal, again, you may have noticed this is damaged. This is what happens if you don't change the bearings. Oh, okay, that's new. But anyways, what this particular pump was my first pump that came with my freeze dryer. And this bearing here basically shattered. And while I didn't know what was happening at the time, all I heard was like a metallic tinging sound. And eventually the whole thing seized up. Like the humming motor, no pumping, nothing happened at all. And I didn't even know if this thing was still covered under warranty. It turns out it's a year and a half, and the warranty only lasts for 1 year. And guess what? The maintenance is due after 1 year. Or 1 year of regular use anyways. It's 8,000 hours according to the manufacturer. That's just for the tip seals. The bearings are supposed to last longer than that. But the point is, whether this thing was a manufacturing defect is not the point. It's not under warranty anymore. And when that thing shattered, the balls that came out of that and got eaten and just obliterated this whole thing. So this is scrap. So that's the consequences of only changing the tip seals and the shaft seals, which is the general maintenance that you're supposed to do after 8,000 hours. And the bearings, which is another kind of cost that's supposed to be done along with the shaft seals and everything, another 8,000 hours after that. The bearings that are used are high quality. The brand is NSK, made in Japan. Bearings, they're a lot more expensive than generic bearings. So I'm going to suggest don't cheap out. Maybe in here you might be able to cheap out a little bit because that's totally contained. If something goes wrong, it'll just stop working. Getting on to the next part. This is the inner orbital scroll. This thing can sometimes come up and slide off the shaft. Like there's nothing holding this shaft in anymore. I could just pull this thing right out right now. And the point is that it's a floating scroll, right? So there's nothing holding this thing in. You got to pay attention to a number of things, like where this where this surface lines up with the shaft seal. It should be the same on both sides. That's more important when putting it back together. That determines how much shim space you need on each surface. Because the thing that holds this drive shaft in place are these fans. So they have to be set to... Yeah, sorry, I had a camera error. It's saying these fans need to be set to the right height when put everything back together, and that is determined by that shaft. Anyways, what I was getting back on track here, this drive shaft has been removed. It slides right out with a little bit of persuasion. And the next thing is to remove this thing. Again, sometimes this thing can come out on its own, and sometimes it'll just pop out really easily. But like I'm trying to get in there. Again, if this thing wasn't already damaged, I would want to be really careful with this, right? If this thing gets scratched, then you're going to reduce your performance. So that one just popped out by hand. Let's see if I can get lucky with this one as well. Nope, it's getting pretty tight. The manufacturer, they used an Allen key, but again, there's some surfaces in there you don't really want to scratch. So an alternative is this kind of thing here. That just goes in there, pop it up like that. And I'm being a little rough with it because this thing is junk. It's just for demonstration. It's a lot easier with two hands, you know. There you go. So that's the inner scroll. The other side is totally fine. The tip seals are still there and everything. So we're going to put that aside. And then again, this is the part that failed on me. Is actually probably this one, but it doesn't really matter to the point. You can see where it started eating the ball from the ball bearing. So these guys are called, what are they called again? Crank pin or a crankshaft. So depending on the model of a vacuum pump, this one here with the black feet has two bearings buried down inside, or they're held in place by these screws here. Again, if you have the attitude, it's like, oh, I don't have a number 3 Phillips, I only have a number 2. A number 2 will work, right? It might work once until you strip something. You got to use the right tools. This machine, you have to use the right tools. Again, this is not something Harvest Right wants to coach people on and how to do this yourself. It's kind of a nightmare scenario for them to try and walk people through this rebuild. Anyways, so I have a number 3 right here. If I were just doing the regular tip seal maintenance, that involves this O-ring, this little O-ring right here, the tip seals itself, there's 4, the shaft seals, one on each side in there, and a big shaft seal on each side of this. So there's 2 big shaft seals and 2 little shaft seals with the tip seals. And some O-rings. So there's an O-ring included for the input, which is missing from this. There's an O-ring in there. The manufacturer includes O-ring for that. They include the O-ring for all these other things as well. Anyways, that's not a big deal. If all you wanted to do and you knew what you were doing was just the minor maintenance or the tip seal maintenance, I think it's probably doable. You want to be able to pull that out without damaging any of this, right? So my method is I'll get like a sharpened flat screwdriver and get that in there. But you see, now I'm touching that edge, so I need to protect that with something. So I'll use this piece of wood or something like that. In this particular one, oh, there we go. Yeah, I don't feel right about that. The pick is really useful for this step. If I can find it. Where the heck did it go? There it is. The pick can go in there and just kind of pull that up a little bit. Again, this is getting replaced. It's a kind of an expendable item that if you wreck it, it's not a big deal, but you don't want to get any of the metal scratched or bent or cracked or anything like that. Again, but if you're going to remove the bearing, that's another story. Let me just pull that out and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Yeah, 2 hands, and that just pops right out there. So on the other side of that is that bearing. And when you're doing the major maintenance, and if I were going to buy one of these off eBay, and I did that a couple times already, or some customer is going to send me their unit, I don't know how long it's been running for. I don't know if it's overdue for maintenance or anything like that, especially with my experience of what happens if you don't change the bearings. I'm going to replace the bearings, right? I know it's an extra cost, but it's better safe than sorry with this equipment. So again, I recommend that for you as well. If you don't know how long overdue your machine is, you got to do the bearings. So that bearing's got to come out. This is the only time. This is mirrored with this one as well, so it's twice that this can work. I got my pin here. it just so happens, this is an imperial measurement. It might be ½ inch, I don't remember. But the point is, it just barely clears in there, but does not clear the bearing. And this is where I can use a hammer. The only time I can use a hammer. Because the reason is, underneath it's rough kind of material, and I'm staying away from the working surfaces. And so the other thing is have that elevated. And again, this would be go somewhere really safe if I'm going to be if that were a live unit, so to speak, not a dead one like it is. Anyway, some wood blocks under here. A nice gap for the bearing to fall out. Again, absolute care. If I miss and hit that, this thing is junk. It's already junk, so I'm not really being that careful. Done. Same thing with this, again, but it's got the feet, so that just pops out. So how do you get the bearings out of this one? And that's what that bearing puller is for. Similar story. Oh, let me just put that aside. Similar story with this. This rubber thing can be pried out. Behind that rubber thing is a snap ring. That's what the snap ring pliers are for. And then you got to use this very special tool to pull those bearings out. That's just the handle for that thing. Again, not a how-to. It's a bit of a setup. I don't know if I should show that or not. This is from Princess Auto. It's the Canadian version of Harbor Freight. There are some positive reviews of it and negative reviews of it. I think people just don't know how to use it. Even then, I kind of forget how to use it periodically. I got to figure out how to do it each time. The point is, if you use it wrong, you just keep expanding these fingers and you end up breaking something. Again, so you got to know what you're doing. This is not for everyone to do this kind of work. Why? So you might ask, why don't I just hook this up somewhere so it's elevated and whack those out with a hammer? Like, if you want your machine to last, then don't use a hammer. If you don't care that much and you got a piece of junk on your hands and you're just going to experiment with it, fine, whatever, use a hammer. But if I'm getting paid, if I ever want to get paid to do this job, I'm never using a hammer on this thing. I have the right tool and I have the right thing to pull the snap ring out. That's what's going to happen. What's next? Okay, yeah, this is what's next. So these crank pins, when you're doing the major maintenance, either from Harvest Right or the manufacturer, they'll send you the whole thing. And so these number 3 Phillips just come out. They might be a little tight, but you'll be fine. And then this thing comes out. This is where a lot of people run into trouble. Again, when I was working with this the first time, I was dealing with a busted bearing. So I didn't really care that much. I just had to yank it out. But I'm not sure if the broken bearing caused this. I'm not sure how well this will show up on camera, but now that's a banana shape. This is now scrap. Cannot be reused. If you ever want to reuse these pins, you have to be careful to take them out. Again, you might have replacements for them already, but again, I wouldn't throw out these other ones if they're still good. You need and even the manufacturer, they use a special tool to remove these, even though they're not going to reuse them. That's where this comes in. So this I set up because sometimes these are jammed in there really good, and if you don't want to pull on that bearing, right? You don't want to, because it's offset, right? If you got to pull from the middle. If you pull from that bearing, especially if it's jammed in there, it's like a vacuum tight seal. It's a clearance fit. It's very tight. You could end up bending the whole thing, right? And then if it gets jammed, or even worse, because it's bent, then you're really in trouble. You have to use the right tool for the right job. In that case, it's this one. Now, all these extra bolts and threads on here are in case it's really jammed. It's kind of like a pulley puller, but in this particular case, it's not that hard. So I set that up so that it could pull and while this thing stays stationary. And it's a really tight fit to get in there. The idea is that it goes like that, right? It's a really nice snug fit. It goes right around the collar, right in the center of the shaft. So that would go on there. In this particular spot, there's lots of clearance on those other two spots, but this one's the tightest. Like that bearing is right up against that wall. There you go. And pulls that out. And that just, you get drop-in replacements when you get the kit, and then you're good to go. But if you want to rebuild that, that's a whole nother tool set. Yeah, again, not everyone's going to have these tools, especially with that one that requires custom tools to do that. So those three come out, new ones go in, new shaft seals go in, new bearings go in. Then you got to put the whole thing back together, and that's where things can get complicated again. Okay, so let's just say that I put in new bearings. There's rubber O-rings inside these channels, all three. Let's say those have been replaced as well. And I'm going to push this back in. What the manufacturer shows, what they do is they just line that up and they just push down really hard with a lot of weight, and it just pops in place. And then it can still move, it moves freely. Nice and smooth, right? The thing is, if you do it that way, when you put in your drive shaft, you won't know for sure if it's the right height. You got to, before you do any of that, you got to put the drive shaft in here first and see what it looks like on the other side before it goes in, because it'll tell you how far in you got to push it. I'll show you what I'm talking about in a second. Okay, so I put in my drive shaft, and it looks pretty good, but if you look at the other side, especially with the light, you see it's not flush. You know, there's a gap there. That shaft seal is not fully engaging with the shaft, so that is sticking out a little bit too much. So a little bit of gentle tapping, and kind of get it back in place. But there, you see I went a little bit too far. Let's go back again. Keep my finger so I can feel it. And that's as best as I'm going to get with this particular drive shaft. Again, there's some variety in these. Sometimes there's more meat on there than others. But the main thing is you want to keep that as centered as possible. And then, so now you know where that lands when it's centered on both sides. You have to use that as a reference. The shaft is going to come back out again. You put the scroll in, and then you put your shaft in. Once the shaft is in, then you can put your fans on the other side. That's even before you put the bottom half in, because when you tighten down these screws on this, it might shift that drive shaft a little bit, and then it's no longer mated with the shaft seals, in which case the shims are wrong, which totally could be a possibility coming from China like that. That's how you get the alignment right. So you get this in first to get a point of reference. You pull it back out, you put it all together, you push it in, then before putting the whole thing back together again, this thing goes on with the screw and everything, and then you can flip it up and just have the weight on the fan there. Again, lots of stuff can go wrong. Yeah, I have a cat. Hello, cat. Yeah, that cat is really distracting. I kind of lost where I was. I'm just going to wrap this up real quick, though. It's just really being attentive to a detail with this. Like, for example, when I was practicing and learning how to do this done, I did pull it apart like 3 times because I kept forgetting to put this O-ring in. Likewise, this one here, I lost one once, but that was a standard one, so you can replace it pretty easily. Yeah, again, not for non-technical people, then that's putting it politely. This is not trivial, and so I would really recommend you, if you're in the United States, you send your unit to Harvest Right on a regular basis. And if you're in Canada, give me get in touch with me, and I can help you out. Okay, that's it, I guess. Thanks if you made it this far. Thanks for listening. And I'm sure there's going to be some comments about the solution to all of this is just to switch to the oil pump or the Premier pump or whatever. And I have my reasons for using an oil-free pump. I don't really want to get into that here. But the main thing is I want everyone to know that it's very easy to slip into like an identity kind of thing, like iPhone and Android. It's like some people love their Premier pump and the oil is totally fine and you don't need to change it every time. That's fine. That's great. Good for you. I like this one. And so don't judge me on my preferences and don't judge other people on their preferences. If you want an oil pump, great, good. They're super cheap and they can work. But, you know, there's reasons for this as well, advantages and disadvantages to everything. And so I know there are some people out there who wanted to give this a shot, and now they're getting into trouble because getting this thing to the States and back is a pain in the ass from Canada. And now it seems to me it's the first time anyone's kind of opening up to the public about making a service available to get these things going properly. Anyways, that's it for me. Thanks so much for getting this far again. You have a great day. Okay, I did forget to mention this tool here. This is with the bearing extractor. I just used it. These bearings are now extracted. The other thing about that is when you're putting in new bearings, it's important to use a press like this. Because if you gotta have to go get them in straight. If they get in crooked, you're gonna end up breaking something. Just kind of set it, and I use a washer as a buffer. Again, there are two bearings. I just do one at a time, right? You got to get them all the way at the bottom because there's a snap ring that holds those bearings in. Yeah, you get the idea. And then the other bearing can go on top of that. Repeat, and that's the same thing for both sides.